Hello and welcome back, and that is right, it's time for another Plex Media Server test. Now, how many of these videos have I done by now? I've genuinely lost count. But in today's video, we are looking at a cheeky little 1U 4-bay rack mount from QNAP. Now, hand on heart, I would not really recommend this system for Plex Media Server, which of course then begs the question that you're asking, why the hell am I featuring it here on the channel? Now, this is the TS-435XeU. It's more of a business class NAS. It's got 10 GB E on board. It's supports QTS5. It's a decent enough little rack mount from QNAP. It's an affordable 4-bay 10 GB E solution. It's even got 2.5 GB on there for good measure. But the reason I'm covering it here on the channel is mainly because of this. The CPU inside this system, the Marvell CN913X quad-core 64-bit ARM processor, an ARMv8, that's a quad-core 2.2 GHz processor. It's also got 4 GB of memory, which can be upgraded, I believe, quite high. I think either 16 or 32 GB. Now, the reason I want to talk about this CPU and Plex is we're seeing more and more affordable NAS systems arriving on the market in both desktop and rack mount form. Now, a lot of these are arriving with either ARM-based processors or they are arriving with non-GPU embedded processors. So, a lot of you who are buying NASs for lots of things such as surveillance, general media streaming, backups, multi-tier backups, and more are curious about how these systems also perform in Plex, because they don't have any kind of transcoding engine on board, they don't have embedded graphics, and those CPUs, although they're pretty good for efficient throughput, don't really write home that hard about the idea of multimedia streaming and playback. So, because of this CPU starting to appear on more and more NAS radars and spec sheets, I wanted to perform today's Plex test. So, although this Plex test is about that 1U, predominantly I want to talk more about that CPU, the CN913X. So, as you can see, we are running the same setup we normally do. We've got Plex Media Server installed. We're going to be using all of our test files, along with, of course, the jellyfish files from the nice ones, all the way down to the nightmare file down there at 1.4 gigabytes at just 30 seconds. We're going to be running Plex Media Server with a Plex pass. As you can see, we're already running it. There's our films there. On the right hand side of the screen, you can see the 435XeU. We're running it on the IP, so local access here. We also have enabled the transcoding engine, as you can see. Even though hardware transcoding isn't possible, we've made sure that the NAS and indeed the Plex Media Server client isn't going to try and restrict us in any way. And in today's video, we're going to be playing a series of 720, 1080p and 4K files. Now, I've mentioned this in other videos, but more and more I'm hearing it in the comments. So, although I do touch on this in all of my videos, I very rarely mention this at the start, so I'm really sorry about this long introduction, but a number of you do ask why I include transcoding in my tests. So, for example, with the matrix here, which is a 720p file, I would play this file natively on a local area network, and the file would play here in the background, all nice and fine and dandy. And then for some reason, while I'm playing these files, I then suddenly decide to test this system and push it quite hard. I'll move away from that 720p file, and then I'll decide to bring it down to something painful, like 240p. And a lot of you wonder why exactly I do that. And the reason I do that is because a lot of the time when you're using Plex Media Server, if you're watching things on the local area network or on the TV that you've got in your front room that share in the same network, internet, whatever you want to call it, connection, there's not going to be any difficulties to play most media. But what if you're accessing files when you're on the train in the morning on the commute? What if you're on holiday? What if you're accessing the files while you're at work? What if multiple people are accessing the NAS all at the same time? Your bandwidth may be affected. The amount of throughput that can be presented from the NAS to your connected devices may also be affected. The internet connection you use while you're on that public Starbucks Wi-Fi or that Southwestern Railway Services 10 meg of data isn't going to go very far. The same goes if you're using older phones, legacy devices, non-smart TVs. These are some devices that don't play very well with very high-end media. And in those scenarios, you would either automatically or manually transcode the file. Because I'm not able to emulate these things for this video, I'm forced to artificially create transcoding scenarios. That's why I changed the size of all these files in my videos, because I want to not only show that these NASes can play these files and how well they play them in terms of CPU and memory, I also want to show scenarios where what if you're trying to access the data and you need the NAS to reshape and change the file, much like you're seeing with the 720p version of the original Matrix being converted into 240p. As you can see, that transcoding takes a lot out of this CPU. With no embedded graphics on board, it will push the CPU quite hard. So for now, let's come out of that file, which was able to play perfectly well in its original format. Transcoding down to the lowest ebb did seem to work very hard. And now we're going to, oh no, I almost selected the wrong NAS. We want to go back into the films database there, and this time we want to test Little Shop of Horrors. Now with Little Shop of Horrors, this is a 1080p media file here, slightly higher bit rate. If we open it up at the bottom, it's 1.9 megabits per second. Don't worry, we'll be hitting the hundreds of megabits per second later. And as we can see, we can flick along in the original quality. Plays like an absolute charm. It's going through again. I mention this in all of my videos. If you've not watched the original dark ending of Little Shop of Horrors, please go out and watch it. It's incredible. But as you can see, it's all running fine, and the CPU on the right hand side of the screen is doing absolutely fine. So let's run some of those transcodes. Now we're going to knock this down to 720p. 720p, nice and simple, immediate transcode there, no difficulties whatsoever. It's playing like a dream. So now we're going to make our way down even further, this time to 40p. Now this is where that CPU is probably going to have to work a little harder. You're going to see the dark orange line start to appear. That's the buffering. That is the CPU starting to get the video kind of transcoded and ready in the background. So as you can see, as I zoom out again, don't worry about the jumps in frame rate there. That's just me mucking around with the zoom in and zoom out. It is able to transcode that file, but it is pushing that CPU pretty hard, being non-GPU embedded. So do bear that in mind if you are going to be looking at transcoding. It can be done, and there'll be a slight pause for a few seconds, but at least at this tier, it's possible. So from here, we want to make our way back into the multimedia menu there, and this time we're looking at 4K and 1080p media. These are the jellyfish files. Now, if you've not watched my videos before, these are a series of the same 30-second file. It's available online. The link should be in the description. And this 30-second file gets bigger and bigger with each iteration. So it starts at a highly, easy to play 3 megabits per second 1080p file at just 10 megabytes. And then by the end, as we scale through, it ends on 1.4 gigabytes. That's huge. That's a 400 megabits per second 4K Ultra HD HEVC 10-bit MKV file. Now, before I start playing these files, and if you've already heard me say this in other videos, fast forward a couple of minutes, because I'm going to just explain the difference between all of these terms just very quickly. So, firstly, let's talk about the megabits per second. That's kind of like the refresh. The higher that number is, the more the data there is, effectively. So that's one of the earliest indicators of the heavy data. HD 480p is obviously a resolution. Now, H.264 and HEVC are compression techniques. These are what help a film, when it's in the cinema on an enormous screen, be watchable in the home. Compression techniques are what make these enormous files manageable. It's what turns a 500 terabyte movie screen projection and DCP digital cinema package into a simple file that you can carry on a USB. Now, H.264 is the older compression technique of the two. It's also only got a single patent license needed, and it can be played on any device effectively in 2022. HEVC, or otherwise known as Highly Efficient Video Codec, or H.265, is the newer compression technique, and unfortunately it also has a lot more complex patent and licensing behind it. The result is that a lot of devices, not just NAS devices but also client hardware, even mobile phones, isn't able to play this natively, either without a license or just generally with no compatibility, as it's a streaming license. The result is that these files will have to be automatically transcoded by the system. You have no way of playing them natively without a license. QNAP indeed, in their application center, does provide the means to play back these files natively in a number of different ways, such as the CN license, which allows you to add the ability to play HEVC or H.265 files natively without transcoding. However, that only applies to Video Station and cannot be carried over to Plex Media Server. Finally, HEVC 10-bit, otherwise known as HDR. And that's really it. As these files get bigger, the NAS will have to work harder to play them. The H.265 files are easy to play and will be played first time, but as they get heavier, we'll need more resources to play them. Here's an example. This is the lightest file. We play this file. As you can see, it immediately plays. 3 megabits per second, 1080p. The orange line is already filled up, the buffering. It's only a 30-second file, and the CPU hasn't broken a sweat. In other words, this has gone absolutely fine. We come out of that. We'll make our way up to the next one, which is 10 megabits. So now it's a little over 3 times the bit rate. We open it up. 10 megabit, dark orange down the bottom, buffered immediately, absolutely fine. Let's ramp it up a little bit. Now we're going to the 30 megabits per second. So this is 10 times the bit rate of that first file that we played. Open it up. It's playing the original file format. The dark orange is taking longer to fill up the whole bar. And we're starting to see more bumps here on the CPU utilization. Now this dark orange bar is the system encoding and preparing the file for playback as quick as it can. However, if playback is faster, in other words, 1 second per second than how long the system takes to encode that file, the result is the system hangs and the file freezes. And that's how we know we've reached the end of its limits. Ramping up, we're now on 100 megabits per second. This is more than 30 times the size of the first file we tested. And if we open it up, this is where we're going to start to see some struggle. We're seeing it get ready. We're seeing the dark orange line, but it has stopped at 0.5 there briefly. I still think it'll outpace playback, but not completely. And we may be reaching the end of where this NAS and indeed that CPU can natively play back 1080p media on Plex Media Server. But as we can see, it's catching up and it will still stay ahead. Do bear in mind this is a 30-second file. Imagine this was a 90 or 120-minute movie, how hard your system may have to work. Now we're moving into the 4K area. 120 megabits per second, 4K. Let's play back this file. Open it up, original file format, and 4K is where this CPU is almost certainly going to start to show its creaks. It's still, a pretty well provisioned ARM-based processor, but as you can see as we zoom in, it's reached the 4 or 5 second mark and it's frozen, and this is generally the telltale sign that a system is reaching the end of its tether. In case you're wondering, this is the resources being used by my own host system. As you can see, we've not maxed out what we've got going on there. We're not using GeForce embedded graphics here because sometimes that can offload some of the work. We want all of the work to be done by the native system. As you can see, the 120 has not worked for us here. Let's carry on, but this time we're going to move into the 200 megabits per second. If we weren't able to play the 120, it's a good chance the 200 megabit one will elude us. Now, at the moment, we're hitting that same struggle that we saw before. So what I'm going to do is ask the system to convert automatically to the most optimized format. Now, this probably still won't work, but it's still going to be interesting to see if the system is able to convert this hefty 4K 200 megabit file into something we can use. The CPU has leapt up quite substantially, so it is giving it a try, as we can see here on the right of the screen. But it looks like all of our efforts may not get us anywhere, as high as that CPU utilization is, and indeed even the memory utilization is creeping up, the file hasn't played and it's crashed out. So those are all of our H.264 test files. Now we're going to test out the harder to play Hevc files that immediately require transcoding. As you can see, the system has forced the conversion to happen there in the background. Sorry, I accidentally paused the file. But even then, it looks like this file was going to have difficulty playing it in the first place. It's immediately converted it because we don't have the option to convert the file or play back the file natively. And over here, we can see that CPU utilization once again has gone very high. But it's trying to play back the H.265 file, but playback is so close to that of the encode that it probably, if it makes it, I'll be surprised, but it looks like it won't, and then we'll see the file freeze like so. So again, it looks like this CPU is most certainly not suitable for H.265 media. But let's try just a couple more. We're going to go for the 10-bit version, open it up there. There's our conversion tally. But bear in mind, of course, we're looking at the same 30-second file. It's just getting progressively bigger every time. Also bear in mind, while this is trying to play back this file, that when we were looking at the size of some of those files, 1.4 gigabytes for a 30-second clip means 2.8 gigabytes per minute, which means a movie that's 90 to 120 minutes is going to be a gargantuan amount of data. In other words, the odds of you having media in this sort of scale in your collection is pretty slim. So again, we're bench testing this to the maximum we can, but these are not truly indicative of more recent files that you can find. Also, because we're on the other tab, don't think suddenly the NAS has done a great job of encoding it. Simply that the file wouldn't play when we were on the tab. So, carrying on, we can make our way down to the 100 megabits per second Hevc file. We're going to leave that to play there, and once again we can see that that CPU is working tremendously hard. It's also worth highlighting, as you can see, that the bandwidth, although high, still never leaves 29 megabits per second. If it was megabytes, then we'd be concerned, but at megabits we haven't got too much to be worried about there. The transcoding here at the bottom, if we scroll down, it's reached that elusive 5-second mark, and it's maybe breaking through. But even if it makes it, there's no way at this rate of encode that it can outpace general playback. As you can see, it realized it and it's cut it out. Ultimately right now, I think we've reached the end of this system's tether, and certainly I don't think I can recommend this CPU for 4K media playback in Plex. Carrying on, we can have a look at other deeper methods, and if we go for the two heaviest files, we know that these almost certainly will not play. But let's give them a college try anyway, and indeed, let's pause the file for a moment and just give this system 1 minute to see how far it can encode that file, just to see if it ever could get it done in the meantime. While it does that, it's worth highlighting once again that this CPU, just because it doesn't perform as well as this in Plex, it doesn't stop you from installing one of many applications on this system, such as Video Station, MB, Twonky and more, that allow you to enjoy media that live on the NAS. And a lot of these have got other ways in which they can be more efficient with the CPU resources and playback files that Plex may well struggle with. On top of that, it's worth remembering the multimedia add-ons to head in and make sure you download the extensions for Video Station. This will allow you to scrape a lot of metadata and ultimately turn Video Station into a much more Plex resembling user interface. But now we've given this a minute to try and play back. We've clicked play. We've reached 5 seconds and it looks more and more like this is not going to be the NAS's day to play back such hefty files. But once again, this isn't a NAS that's been designed with this in mind. So, as we let it do its thing, we may have to give it a moment, but for me, this looks like an absolute lost cause. We'll give it 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1, but it kicked us out beforehand. And I think I'm not even going to attempt the nightmare file because the previous file killed it. This file here, that 1.4 gigabyte, would only see it off. But this has been the Plex Media Server test of not only the TS-435XeU, but more importantly, a test of the Marvell CN913X quad-core processor, a processor that's going to arrive in a lot more affordable business solutions soon. So again, understand the limitations of Plex Media Server and CPUs like this, and particularly don't try to play any H.265 or HDR media. This CPU and this NAS probably can't hack it. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Click like if you've enjoyed the video, subscribe if you want to learn more, and use the free advice section over on NAS Compares if you need help choosing the right Plex Media Server NAS for you. Again, people that put stuff in the comments, I do try to read the comments, but we make a video every day. We write an article every 2 days, and the result is it's easier with the advice section if you use that, and it is genuinely free for us to answer everyone's questions and give them free advice in a first come first serve manner. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.